Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is going to be our last session of today of our fourth annual Domestic Violence Awareness Symposium, brought to you by the Collaborative Commission on Domestic Violence. Today, I want to welcome our two presenters for our last session. We're joined today by Shelli Egger, Managing Attorney with the Legal Aid for Survivors of Sexual Assault at Texas Legal Services Center. As well as Alicia Nichols, who is the Director of Innovation at the Battered Women's Justice Center. Battered Women's Justice Project, excuse me. And today they're going to be talking to us about firearms, changes in the law, and how we can all remain resilient in this time. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to them. And if you all would keep in mind on your just keep a lookout on your chat. I'm going to drop some announcements in there as well. Take it away.
No, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Shelli. I honestly, I didn't realize that we were taking everybody home today. So it sounds like you're in the final stretch of the final leg of your day. Thank you so much for spending it with the two of us. We're both very honored to be with you today. I'm just going to start to share my screen here so we can get our slides going for everybody. So give me just a moment, friends. Here we go. Let's get this queued up. All right, Shelli, I can't see you anymore, and I can't see our friends in the audience. And how are we looking though on the shared screen?
Looks good to me.
Excellent. Okay, everyone, again, it is lovely to spend our day with you. Today's session, Firearms, Changes in the Law and How to Remain Resilient. Before we begin, I certainly just want to address, this is certainly a heavy topic. Shelli and I want you all to take very good care of yourselves as you maybe are reflecting on some of the experiences you or your loved ones have had with gun violence and domestic violence, and also just knowing that you all are in the great state of Texas, and like the great state of Minnesota where I live, we have had our own share of gun violence related tragedies in the community. So just want to remind folks, this is a heavy topic, and please do take care of yourselves and do what you need to share your time with us today. So Shelli and I wouldn't be here without the guidance and the support of funding of our programs. And so again, my name is Alicia Nichols, and I am the Deputy Director of the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence and Firearms, a part of the Battered Women's Justice Project. And the National Resource Center is funded graciously through the Office on Violence Against Women and the U.S. Department of Justice. Shelli's work is also funded and supported by the Texas Access to Justice Foundation. Shelli, is there anything you want to share with us about your funding or give a shout out?
No, just that the LASA program at TLSC is funded by TAJF. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, really quickly, who we are and why we're here to speak with you today. Again, my name is Alicia. I serve as the Director of the Innovation Division at BWJP, as well as the Deputy Director of the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence and Firearms. We are headquartered out of St. Paul, Minnesota. We are the national training and technical assistance providers for both the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women and also the Department on Health and Human Services. Shelli, I'll turn it over to you if you want to introduce and give a little bit of your background as well.
Sure. I've been at the at Texas Legal Services Center since March of 2022 with the LASA program. Before that, I spent 12 years at a different legal aid organization working on the family violence team and doing primarily domestic violence cases and family law, stalking, human trafficking, all that sorts of stuff. And I've also been the policy chair for the Austin Travis County Family Violence Task Force, where most of my work is devoted to trying to implement our firearms surrender protocol.
Excellent. Thank you. And that's actually how I would say how Shelli and I, our paths have crossed. In my work, I'm assisting communities throughout the country on the implementation of firearm prohibitions in domestic violence cases. And of course, Shelli's work in gender-based violence. And then also this connection that we'll be sharing with you later in the presentation around the efforts of domestic violence and firearms violence and its correlation to community violence. So we're really excited to share with you today what it is that we know can prevent domestic violence and firearm related violence. And certainly through criminal and civil justice systems. But we're hoping today to walk you through, just give us some grounding in, of course, in some data and some stats around the prevalence of the issue, talking about homicide prevention. Of course, we'll be talking about state and federal prohibition laws. We want you all to know, please don't worry, the sky is not falling. Shelli has made some time in our presentation this afternoon to share some information about Rahimi, which of course is a case out of the Fifth Circuit. And so we'll be sharing some information about that, but then really are wanting you all to also start to think about what are, I hate to use this word alternatives, because I feel like it's not very clear about what it is that we're saying, but Shelli and I are of the mindset that the criminal and civil justice systems can be very helpful in reducing harm. However, it isn't solely the responsibility of system actors to prevent and to reduce crime and to permanently intervene right in our communities. And so what are other community-based organizations, supports, community violence efforts, interventions, et cetera, that we might also want to lean on? So those are some of the things that we hope to be able to share with you during the amount of time that we've got. Shelli and I are also, we have a lot of information that we want to get through. I know I can start to talk really fast, but I just want to encourage and remind all of you that Shelli and I are always here and available to answer any questions moving forward. A part of what it is that we do in our work is troubleshoot and provide training and technical assistance. So please feel free to reach out after today's session as well. So with that, like I said, just to get us grounded in some of the numbers and the data and prevalence and why we should be paying attention to this. So in terms of domestic violence, gender-based violence, we know that 20 people are physically abused by their intimate partners every day. 1 in 5 women have experienced severe intimate partner violence in their lifetime. 1 in 7 men have experienced severe intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And then we know this last one here, that 36% report to police about domestic violence. So I think it is safe to say, and I'm preaching to the choir a little bit in this regard, as you are all system actors, and you see this in your courtrooms every single day. I imagine that the numbers are probably a lot higher than what it is that we're seeing, but because of a variety of different barriers to reporting, right, we don't always have an accurate picture, but that doesn't mean that what you see on your screen isn't still startling and absolutely alarming, and that it shouldn't be taken seriously. I don't by any means mean to insinuate that with my comments. But so again, a serious and pervasive problem. And then when we look at the United States in terms of gun deaths, we know that in 2021, there were over 48,000 gun deaths, right? Almost 20,000 of those gun homicides, and just over 26,000 of those were gun suicides. We know that this is a unique problem to the United States. We don't see numbers like this anywhere outside of the United States. And I think that we can all agree that we know that there are solutions, interventions that we can take through the criminal and civil justice system, but also in our communities to help reduce these numbers so that we're not losing so many of our family members, our loved ones, our neighbors, etc. Now, when you bring domestic violence and firearms together, when these two things collide, Senator Paul Wellstone was from the state of Minnesota, where I was born and raised and continue to practice. And when he was on the floor debating 18 USC 922 G9, which is in correlation to prohibitions for domestic violence offenders, the one thing that he said was, all too often, the only difference between a battered woman and a dead woman is the presence of a gun. And he couldn't have been more accurate. And the numbers over the years just continue to become more and more startling as more and more firearms become readily available to falling into the hands of people who shouldn't have them, who we know use violence, who we know are prone to using lethal violence, which also trickles out and spills over into communities and creates acts of mass violence, But again, when domestic violence and gun violence come together, we know that just simply an abuser's access to that firearm can increase the risk of homicide substantially. We know that more than half of the women killed in the United States, that more than half of them are killed with a gun. in an average month, and I've seen two countering statistics here. So I've seen this last one here in an average month, anywhere from 50 to 70 American women are shot to death by their intimate partners. And something that isn't on the slide that I also just want to highlight for us is that many of these relationships tend to be dating relationships, and also what we have found is that the homicides are not the domestic violence homicides are not necessarily planned. That I think it's 63% of these are of the homicides are taking place during the course of an argument alone. There's no other type of crime being committed. It is an argument. Someone has access to a gun. It is easy. It's either loaded or is easy to load, and then is fired and causes great bodily harm, injury, and death. So also, right, we know that simply removing it, not having access to it, certainly does reduce injury and risk. The impact on others. We can't ignore that it isn't only women and children and their extended loved ones who are impacted by this. There is certainly a ripple effect of harm. Shelli and I care very deeply about the sanctity of life, and we want to honor that and the importance of that. And so we are just as concerned about the safety of the person who is using violence in the relationship. And we know that 9 out of 10 murder-suicides are connected to domestic violence. And so we don't want any loss of life. We don't want folks who use violence to harm themselves, to harm their family or their extended community members. But we know that when they have access to guns, that most certainly does happen. So there certainly is a correlation between murder, suicides, and domestic violence. We know that domestic violence calls are extremely dangerous calls for law enforcement and other first responders to go to. And of course, we can't deny, and I believe Judge Diaz was kind enough to share with us that it sounds like in the previous year that this particular audience has already explored the connection of domestic violence and gun violence and the relationship to mass shootings. And so we know that right in more than 2/3 of mass shootings that the shooter has a history of domestic violence. And so there are red flags. There are signs that we know. Again, I think I'm preaching to the choir. You all are well aware of this, but the impact, right, it's just this huge ripple effect, and for a long time. And I didn't mention this earlier, but before coming to BWJP, I spent 7 years. I spent 7 years in public safety, and then another 7 years working in corrections, primarily with men and women who were serving life sentences, many of them for having killed their intimate partners. And it was an opportunity for me as an advocate for the really to bear witness to how this type of pain and trauma stays with a person and transforms over the lifespan. It isn't something that ever goes away. People have said to me, now I'm a part of a club that I didn't want to be a part of, and with every passing year, something else changes, and I have a different feeling about the harm. And so certainly understanding that there is this ripple effect of harm that lasts for generations. Shelli and I like to say that we are in the homicide prevention business. And so we know that there certainly are interventions, as I have said, through state and federal laws in terms of what it is that we can do to prevent access for those who we know who have shown to be dangerous and to violate the law, either with gun related or in violent misdemeanors. There are 27 states that do prohibit firearms for that population. And what we also know, and this is significant, is that laws such as this, regardless of the relationship, we know that there is a reduction in not only intimate partner homicide, like overall intimate partner homicide, but that there's also a reduction in intimate partner homicide with a firearm. And I realize that this, my F is missing from this acronym. I apologize for any confusion there, but all of that is just to say that we know that not only removing the firearm reduces intimate partner firearm homicide, but also overall intimate partner homicide. There are state laws around protection orders, as many of you already know, that there are more than 2/3 of states that do prohibit the possession of a firearm by someone who is subject to a domestic violence protective order. And about half of these states do authorize or require a court issuing that order to require relinquishment or surrender of that firearm. In terms of ex parte protection orders, now, and we know that in ex parte protection order, the period after filing is absolutely often the most, is the period of most risk for the victim or survivor of domestic violence. And so we know that there are 16 states that do allow for firearm surrender or seizure at this stage. You can see them, the states that they are there. And we know that in ex parte DVRO firearm restrictions were associated again with that reduction in intimate partner homicide and intimate partner homicide with a firearm. So again, this is all to say that when we have orders in place, when we're enforcing the law and we have implementation mechanisms in place for relinquishment, we do know that we can reduce injury and death. Something else that has been coming up, and then I'm going to let Shelli transition to Texas law in more specifically for a moment, and then talk about Rahimi. Many of you have probably heard about extreme risk protection orders or gun violence restraining orders, also known as red flag laws. You can see here the states that currently do, some of the states that currently have those. And now we know that, well, we know with extreme risk protection orders, right, those are things that in some states can only be petitioned by law enforcement, and others, in other states, who can petition is a bit broader. We know that there is a reduction in firearm suicide. You can see in the states of Connecticut and Indiana, they've reduced that firearm suicide rates and have data to share with us. However, the concern that we have in the domestic violence movement is that extreme risk protection orders are being applied to cases of domestic violence. And the difference primarily between extreme risk protection orders and a domestic violence protection order is that an extreme risk protection order doesn't name a protected party. There also is no other relief, right? Oftentimes in civil court, when someone is seeking that protection order, there's other types of relief around custody and finances, and right, the car and the home and other things that tend to be a part of that, where which is absolutely necessary for that survivor to have respite and safety. And again, so not saying that extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws are bad by any means. That's not what I'm saying. But we do want to urge caution in terms of the domestic violence movement as to how these are used and how they're applied to these cases.
So in Texas, we have laws on the books that already have certain categories of folks who are prohibited possessors. And the two that we're primarily talking about today are folks who have been convicted of misdemeanor domestic violence. They are prohibited from possessing firearms or ammunition for a period of 5 years following their release from confinement, from jail, or from community supervision, so probation. And so that's only a 5-year limitation. And then if anyone is subject to a protective order, they are also a prohibited possessor. And in Texas, that's basically talking about 3 separate types of orders: a family violence protective order, a stalking protective order, and a sexual assault protective order. Family violence protective orders are under Chapter 85 of the Texas Family Code, and stalking and sexual assault protective orders fall under Chapter 7B of the Code of Criminal Procedure. The protective order prohibition, however, does not apply to a police officer. That's why there's an asterisk there under someone subject to a protective order. So a police officer who is actively engaged in employment as a full-time paid sworn law enforcement officer by a state agency or a city or county subdivision of the state would not be subject to that prohibition. So Rahimi, I don't know exactly who's in our audience today, if you might have heard of this case, but it's a case that came out of the Fifth Circuit, which is a federal court. And so this decision only applies in Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And what happened in Rahimi is that the defendant, Mr. Rahimi, was subjected to a protective order in February of 2020. It was a civil protective order that his ex-girlfriend obtained against him. While he was subjected to that protective order, he engaged in 5 different shootings in Texas. He shot at a police officer's car. He shot at a Whataburger. He fired shots into the air when his friend's credit card was declined. He shot at someone after selling them drugs. So there were many different instances where he was out in public using this firearm. And after he was arrested, he was charged with being in possession of a firearm in violation of this protective order. He appealed, saying that prohibition violated his Second Amendment rights. And the Fifth Circuit agreed with him. They said that that applying the tests that the Supreme Court set forth in the Bruin case, that the court had to look only at historical analogs. So was there a law in place between the time that the Second Amendment was enacted and the time that the 14th Amendment was enacted that is similar enough to this law that under a challenge based on the Second Amendment? And the court found that the law that allowed the firearm to be removed from him because of the protective order was a historical outlier that our founding fathers at the time between the Second and the 14th Amendment would never have allowed, that they would not have enacted such a prohibition. And to be honest, I think a lot of people would agree that sure, there were a lot of shortcomings during that time period, that we're looking at a very short, limited time period where victims of domestic violence were not offered a lot of protection. So in order to overcome this, many briefs have been filed in this case to try to identify other laws that could be analogous or similar enough in order for that prohibition to stand. This case is up before the Supreme Court on November 7th of this year, so it's coming very quickly. There's a lot of concern about what it will mean if this decision is allowed to stand. And honestly, we have no idea how this is going to go. The Supreme Court test that was set forth in Bruin, allowing the court to only look at that historical time period, is a very short time period. And they're either going to have to walk back a little bit on that, or they're going to have to find some way to carve out an exception here so that this law would be allowed to stand. But what this does not do is strike down any state laws. And Texas, as we talked about, already has a state law that offers the same protection to victims when they have a protective order in place. What I think is important about Rahimi is that the decision in itself didn't change a whole lot about what was happening here in Texas, because I can promise you, as someone who's been practicing law here for 15 years, I've never found a federal prosecutor who was willing to file charges for someone violating a protective order by being in possession of firearms. What you can see in Rahimi is that even in this case, no one was going after him to try to enforce this protective order. It was only after there had been these other 5 shootings that someone finally paid attention to this prohibition. And then he was charged under this law instead of being charged under something else, which is how this case came about. But I think that what we need to know is that while it is something for us to be nervous about and to be concerned with this case, the sky is not necessarily falling. It's not changing the way that anything is actually happening here in the state of Texas. It just reminds us that in addition to looking at these legal protections, we also have to look elsewhere in our communities and at other strategies that we can turn to in order to keep victims of domestic violence safe.
Thank you, Shelli. So that is a perfect segue into why surrender laws are not enforced. So a part of the work that I do nationally is travel around to communities and assist them with developing a mechanism for surrender. And that is because there is there's a lack of a protocol. The one thing that federal law does not do is, it doesn't outline the actual procedure for surrender or relinquishment, definitely getting to be the end of the day. And so states are then left to create their own, and many states tend to fail to do so, right? And that tends to be because there's often a lack of coordination. This is something that really does involve, in order for relinquishment and surrender to go smoothly, to create safety, there has to be collaborative efforts amongst all of the system players, and most certainly amongst community-based advocates. And when I mean when I say community-based advocates, I don't just mean domestic violence advocates and advocates working around gender-based violence. I also would encourage you to consider bringing other anti-violence organizations and groups to the table, people who have an understanding of how the violence is is showing up in relationships and in communities, in different ways that our traditional domestic violence advocacy programs may not be getting to. And so really having that collaborative effort. And this last one, I always have to say this, because if I don't, someone's going to say, what about? And yes, there is. Sometimes there can be a lack of resources, which prevents these laws from fully being implemented, around time, money, and staff. But what we have found time and time again across the country is that it doesn't actually take a significant amount of time, money, or staff time to be able to do this. And I'm happy to share information with all of you about evidence techs and court clerks and law enforcement who have really come up with innovative and thoughtful ways. And many of them, Texas has been, I want to just like a tip of the hat to Texas, because you all have been really innovative also in terms of where these firearms, when relinquished, can be stored. And so I want to call you all out for that, because it is a model that I have talked about time and time again. And that particular model is around working with gun ranges around the storage of those firearms. And so again, kudos to all of you in being creative around getting around that time, money, staffing issues. But in terms of implementing a firearm surrender protocol, there are 3 or really 4 different methods to this. I'm sorry, 3. So we've got this court-centered, right, where this is where we've got the bench and prosecutors coming together and leading the efforts. We've got law enforcement who are bringing forth all of the issues about violence that's happening in the community. They're responding to domestic violence calls time and time again. And often are interfacing with families in a different way than the rest of us are, and can be really instrumental in setting the tone for accountability. And then also we've seen some really strong protocols developed through probation. Jennifer Wendell is a probation officer and former investigator out of DeKalb County, Georgia. She is now with BWJP, and she was instrumental in DeKalb County through probation at finding a way to hold men and women who were on her probation caseload accountable for firearms. She essentially was operating not under a state law, but under federal law, and was able to create an affidavit for folks who were on her caseload to either notifying them that they were now a prohibited party and had to surrender firearms, and assisted them in how to do that, or they signed an affidavit that said, no, I don't have any firearms. As some of you may know, one of the standard conditions of release is that when you are on probation or parole, is that you don't violate the laws of any city, state, municipality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so Jen, in this particular case, was able to have an affidavit on file. And later on, when it came when it came up that this person or caseload maybe was in possession of a firearm, that's how she was able to really hold them accountable and get weapons out of their hands. So probation is certainly an underutilized resource in this area, and where we see the most protocols coming out of are really, again, that court-centered through prosecution, through civil court, and then law enforcement, but wanted to really hone in on probation in this particular instance, because again, it really is an underutilized resource, and it's probation officers that tend to have lengthy relationships, right, with their client base and their families, and so can build some rapport over time, which can also aid in accountability. So wanted to make sure I mentioned that. One of the things that we also see that's absolutely critically necessary to developing an effective protocol, again, is engaging the necessary stakeholders, as I mentioned. So we want folks from the courts. I want the court clerk. The court clerks know everything. They're brilliant and they know everything. And they can really help us smooth or like streamline processes. And they have they're usually really in tune with whose role is what, which can be really helpful. Again, law enforcement officers play a critical role in this, either police or sheriff, around service and also relinquishment, prosecutors, victim witness coordinators, advocates. It says here domestic violence advocates, but again, really want to hone in on you all thinking more broadly about who an advocate is and who can be helpful to the group. Advocates are the group that I oftentimes see left out, or who don't have a seat at the table. And again, domestic violence advocates and other advocates can be really, really beneficial to the group in sharing information and how these acts really show up in the day-to-day lives and what the lived experiences of the clients in the community is. And again, I've talked about probation and parole. The one that's not on here that I would also encourage folks to bring in to engage a stakeholder is the defense bar and defense attorneys, right? We're not trying to, this isn't about catching people. This isn't about taking guns or grabbing guns, right? This is about saving lives and keeping people safe. And we really do want to have opportunities, right, to permanently intervene in the violence and have resources and basic human needs met to break that cycle of violence. And so working with probation, parole, defense attorneys, the defense bar, and making sure that defendants and respondents understand what their responsibilities are, what the prohibitions are, and how to comply is critically important. Again, so the elements of an effective surrender policy is first and foremost finding out how are you going to find out if the person has access or is in possession or ownership or owns a gun? So how are you going to collect information about the firearms? So that is a critical first step. So that may be right, that may be looking at, we've had jurisdictions who are able to pull hunting licenses to look at firearms, right? Can pull permits, can look at other things. But we just, right, oftentimes the victim is also seen as the, right, as the person who's going to know where the firearms are, know what kind of firearms they are. But again, this jeopardizes the victim's safety. And so we really want to urge caution in utilizing and relying on the victim and the survivor disclosing information about where the firearms are. So strongly encourage having conversations with victim advocates about how it is that the conversations around guns even comes about, right? There are some folks who are law-abiding gun owners who have guns and right, who may be concerned about why you're having a conversation about guns. So taking time to think about risk, what it means for kids that could be in the home, really planning and being mindful about that conversation to get information is critical. The court order, judges have to make sure that you are writing a clear and concise order that outlines why the prohibition is met, in addition to making sure at that time during that court order that there's information around how someone's going to comply. Service is critically important, and this is often, as many of you know, a two-step process from it can be serving of the first and temporary order to later a permanent order. So working with sheriffs and law enforcement around service and certainly taking into account safety when those officers are going out and around service. There are other processes which I'd be happy to share with you offline that we can be collecting information over time through 911 and CAD reports about the presence of firearms. If in fact first responders and other folks, when they are receiving those 911 calls, are documenting and asking a series of specific questions. Again, it's critically important to understand the responsibility around relinquishment and surrender. Oftentimes I hear folks say to me, he or she will never comply. They're not going to give up the firearm. It's critically important that as we as professionals understand what our processes are and the mechanisms that we create, it's also important that we're creating documents and mechanisms that are outlining very, very detailed about the prohibition, what happens when, where you go, how you go to law enforcement to surrender the firearms, if a third party transfer is a possibility, what that's going to look like, if you're running background checks on third parties, etc. But it's critically important. And what they found in the state of California recently was there were a group of judges who said, we've got this surrender protocol, right? We're ordering surrender, but no one is complying. No one's complying. And we asked the question, well, tell us what the process is for relinquishment. Where do they go? What do they do? And none of the judges could tell us. And that's where the issue was. And we said, okay, if you can't tell us as the person who's issuing the order, how is the person who has to do the relinquishment and surrender? How do they know, right? And so we created a series of resources and documents for that particular jurisdiction. And guess what? People are complying. They know what to do and where to go, and they are actually complying with the order and relinquishing their firearms. The surrender process, you're going to have very, very detailed instructions around what it is that surrender is going to look like, how you bring those weapons to the police department, right? Unloaded, locked in the trunk, etc. Affidavits and different documents that can be completed to demonstrate to the court that the person is complying with the order, which leads us to our next and final step, which is around compliance and monitoring. Every surrender or relinquishment protocol absolutely should have a compliance and monitoring step in it, because if you don't, you're essentially saying, right, this is the honor system, and we're just going to trust that you're going to do this, and I don't think that's where we want to put our trust right now. So one of the things that we strongly encourage, right, is having affidavits of surrender and relinquishment. So individuals can go to law enforcement, they can get that affidavit signed, it's filed with the court, and now the court knows that the person has complied. There are jurisdictions that that schedule compliance hearings when the issue is, when the order is issued. And again, those jurisdictions have affidavits, because we know, right, we don't want dockets to get clogged. We know your time is important and the day gets long. And so we've got these affidavits that can be signed and filled out. And if done and done correctly and filed with the court, then that compliance hearing is canceled, because we know that it has been done. So I want to stop there, because we know that we have mechanisms in place. I can help you with these. Shelli is available to talk with you about these things. We have from my perspective right now, we do have some pretty effective laws in place around these types of prohibitions, and we have to get a little bit more creative about how it is that we can put all of these different pieces in place, because I know when we do, there certainly is a reduction in intimate partner homicide and intimate partner homicide with firearms. But I want to transition us to talking about the public health aspect of this. And right, we're at a place where we're relying on the civil and criminal justice system to intervene temporarily to offer respite. And Shelli and I and others working in violence prevention think that we're just on the cusp of something, when we can look at this in a much different way from a public health perspective and lens, and talk about the correlation between what we see happening inside of homes and how that spills out into the street in the form of community violence. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Shelli.
Thank you. I couldn't agree with Alicia more that it's so important to talk about how we can implement these surrender policies. We know that it has been the law on the books in Texas for more than 20 years that these firearm prohibitions exist for a reason, because there is extensive data that shows, and we are reminded every single year when our friends from the Texas Council on Family Violence produce their Honoring Texas Victims report about the deadly intersection here between firearms and domestic violence. We know that those laws exist for a reason, but we also know that in almost every one of Texas's 254 counties. Every single time a protective order is issued or a criminal conviction for domestic violence is entered, that respondent or that defendant is walking out of the courthouse without any idea, like Alicia said, about how to comply with those laws. So there's definitely a gap there that has to be filled. As I said in my introduction, I've been working in Travis County for a long time on trying to get our firearms surrender protocol implemented. I have a daughter who will be 12 in 2 weeks, and my firearm surrender protocol binder is older than she is. So I've been working on this for a long time. It's something that I really believe in. But in 2020, I was appointed to the Austin Gun Violence Task Force, and my goal was that come hell or high water, I was going to get a firearm surrender protocol implemented as part of that work through the Gun Violence Task Force. And then, as we all know, a lot happened in 2020. And after George Floyd was killed, we had a meeting of the Austin Gun Violence Task Force where we really came to talk about what that meant for our community, what that meant for what kind of support we were going to get from community for different protocols. And I knew that any recommendation that relied on law enforcement, that relied on our court system for enforcement, was not going to have the community support. And I wasn't willing to push it forward and lose that credibility with community at that time. And so I really shifted my focus to look at through this different lens of the public health approach, and to see that, yes, my law degree doesn't have to be thrown away. I can still use it to utilize legal and regulatory actions to increase safety by enforcing these laws. But I can also view it as part of a much broader movement within our community about how we are trying to prevent these homicides. And so I think that looking at it from whatever perspective you're coming from whatever area you're working in, that there is a way for you to be involved in a public health approach to preventing these homicides, and to really implementing that in your work. So this is something that, even though it's a public health approach, it's something that I use in my work at Legal Aid. It's something that I'm using as a lens to view all of the solutions that we're trying to implement for community safety. And either in this picture here from the White House, when the Safer Communities Act was signed, I was able to be there because of our mutual friend, Amber Goodwin, who's in the photo there on the left. She was actually supposed to be doing this presentation today, so I wanted to make sure that she at least made a small appearance. But I also there was able to meet Erica Ford, who's in the middle of that photo there, who runs Life Camp in New York City. And she's one of the mentors that I really have learned a lot from, her programs in New York City and how they function in terms of community violence intervention. And she, I believe in this quote that we must understand people on both sides of the pistol. They both need our help because hurt people hurt people. And I think that is something that we can't overlook as we're doing this work, because only focusing on our work in domestic violence on the victim side, we're really missing the opportunity for prevention, which is what we're really supposed to be here for. And so if we're thinking about it that way, we have to really look at it from a different perspective in terms of not abandoning our position for being advocates for survivors and victims of domestic and family violence, but really looking at how can we bridge the gap and make connections across our community with other work that's already being done throughout our communities. And one of the things that Erica's team does so well in New York City is community violence intervention work, or CVI. CVI work is programs that use a violence interruption model where they have street outreach workers who are people that have lived experience, and they are from the communities where they work. They provide violence interruption services where if they know that there is a beef happening somewhere in a neighborhood, they can go and intervene and try to stop the violence. They show up at the hospital after a shooting to try to prevent retaliatory shootings. They do a lot of work that has been really effective. It has shown up to 60% reductions in places like Chicago, Richmond, Oakland, and in New York City, which oftentimes, I think when data is floating out there, or when you see news stories about violence in cities like Chicago and New York City, what you see is just that crime is rampant. It's on the increase. It's, none of these strategies are working. But what you don't see is that in the neighborhoods where these programs are working, like in the neighborhoods where these community violence interrupters are working in New York City, they went 562 days without a shooting. Nobody talks about that fact. And because violence is happening elsewhere in the community where they aren't utilizing these strategies, it skews the data and it skews the story, really. And so we're not getting a full picture of what's actually happening. But in the neighborhoods where these strategies have been used and significant investment has been made and they are sustained, they have shown incredible reductions in violence in those particular areas. And usually when the violence spikes, it's because funding was pulled and those programs have gone away. But these strategies have shown to be really helpful in reducing community violence or shootings between individuals who don't have an interpersonal relationship. But they also present a really incredible opportunity, I think, for us to think more broadly about how we can change the work that we're doing here in domestic violence. And I'm so excited to talk about this with Alicia. I told her last night that I'm a total fangirl because a couple years ago, I heard from her about using these CVI strategies to blend together with the work that we're doing with firearms surrender and firearms removal in these types of cases. And I think that it really presents a new way for us to think in the future about how we're going to go about this work. And it would be a blending of like the model that we use for BIPs, because we know that the most effective batterers, intervention and prevention programs use people who are credible messengers and who have a good relationship with the men that they're working with, the men who cause harm, so that they can try to have credibility there and try to make change at that level. So being able to blend those strategies like they're using with CVI with what we're doing here in domestic violence, I think is really something incredible that we can look forward to in the future. And Austin and Houston both are two Texas cities that have invested. I don't know about San Antonio, but Austin and Houston have both invested in CVI strategies. And until those get off the ground, that's something that we'll have to think about for the future, how we might blend that work together. But there are other more community-based options. If you can go to the next slide, Alicia. I think that it's important as we look around our communities to look at what is already working well. For example, we know that there are organizations that are keeping people alive and well, people that are organizations and community-based partners that are filling the gap between what our government and what our systems provide and what folks need to be healthy and well. We know that when there were winter storms, when there were ice storms, there were community-based organizations that were out there handing out food and supplies and helping people get their lives back in order long before any systems folks could show up to the scene. And an example is just looking at one of this barbershop here in Austin that is, well, I'm not in Austin today. Sorry, I'm out of my normal element. I'm coming to you from Pittsburgh, but my heart is always in Austin. So this barbershop in Austin that does excellent work in the community and helping people to meet their needs. They are in an area where there are a lot of community violence shootings, but there are also a lot of domestic violence shootings. And so looking at that, looking at the map and seeing where they're located and how strong they are and how without any funding, without any support, they are already doing this work of preventing, not violence prevention, but they're already doing the work that could prevent violence because it is helping people to meet their basic needs. And so when we look at that, we can also know that in places like Milwaukee, they have a style and substance program that trains barbers and stylists to help identify people in mental health crisis and to intervene, and then to provide them with referrals for counseling, housing, food, and other basic needs, and to help provide them with wraparound services so that they can bring them out of crisis. So how can we work with them? How can we take the model that is already working where we train salon stylists about domestic violence? How could we blend that with something like the Style and Substance Project out of Milwaukee to work with organizations like this, like the Midtown Barbershop, places that are already talking to the folks that need these services the most. And also they're already doing more than cutting hair. So how can we blend those two things together to really try to make an indention in the communities that need our help the most? Those are the kinds of questions that I really encourage you to ask yourself as you're doing this work, and as we're coming together as communities, to not just think about the systems, but to also think about the folks that are already out there on the ground, that already have the connections. We have to recognize that we can't always rush into a community and say that we have the solution when a lot of communities are already doing these things for themselves. They just don't have the resources and the funding that we do in our systems. How can we get that to them so that they can do this work? How can we give them training so that they can identify people who are in crisis, that they can try to intervene and really make the best out of these opportunities?
All right, and that is our questions. Shelli, I'm just going to put I'm going to move to the next slide just so folks have an opportunity just to jot down our contact information if they want it. And then friends, I'm going to stop my share because I'd love to be able to see Shelli and see Noah and also see the chat so I can see some of your great questions. So I'll just give it one more minute here and then I will stop sharing my screen. And we can always enter our contact information in the chat for you as well. All right.
I see you, Rose. Hi, Rose Williams. Rose and I have worked together through the Texas Invest in Us Coalition, which works on getting money for CDI strategies throughout the state of Texas. So I am always happy to see you.
Fabulous. Thank you for being here, Rose. And I was, I don't know if there's any question. I have a comment for you, Shelli. As I was listening to you just share, I was also thinking about other types of community resources and supports that we might want to tap into. And this was not my idea, so I want to give credit where it's due. I believe there were two things that I recently saw in The Trace, which is a great publication around gun violence and gun violence prevention, if you're not familiar. But it was about working with school nurses and this idea, right, that between August and September, approximately 95,000 school nurses, right, went back to school with our kiddos. And so what kind of conversations can we be having around, right, age appropriate, all of those things, right? There are tools for this, but how do we have conversations with kids, right, about what might be going on in their houses? Can we, right, could nurses give out gun locks? Right, just thinking through other groups that might be able to assist us.
Right. I think that's really important. There are so many different partnerships that we could really use to strengthen the services that are already there.
I'm so sorry. So real life is happening at my house. I have a 12-year-old who's homesick today. So real life, he just woke up from his nap. Real life is happening. I am so sorry, everybody. You have my full undivided attention again. But yes. So Shelli, and there was one other, there's another group that I know, I believe in Brooklyn, a group of men that is using restorative justice principles and practices around domestic violence and bringing young men together in circle and in groups to talk about, misogyny and sexism and how it's showing up in their lives, right? Talking about violence, talking about different strategies so that these men have an outlet. And again, to your point, right, credible messengers. These are men in communities are hosting these groups that again, I think it's really important. I've always said, I believe that children need 5 trusted adults in their lives to be successful and right. And so again, I think it's just great to have an opportunity for there to be others in the community who are invested.
Right.
Any other thoughts? Any other questions from anybody? I know it's getting to be the end of the day. You hung in there with us. This is a heavy topic. And thank you, Rose, for dropping that Be Smart for Kids resource in the chat. Thank you for that, so people have access to that.
as questions may be rolling in, I just wanted to remind folks that we do have advocates online and available for you all to speak with today. If you all feel compelled or the need to do so, just make your way over to the expo area, and we have a booth set up for that. You can speak to an advocate if you'd like. So just want to remind everybody of that. Just a couple of other housekeeping announcements. Tomorrow we will begin our agenda once again for our second day of symposium, starting at 8:30 a.m. Central Time. I know we have folks joining us from a lot of different time zones today, because I've been getting a lot of emails. So 8:30 tomorrow Central Time. Come back to this link of where you're that you were sent earlier this morning, and we will recommence our symposium. Alicia, Shelli, thank you so much for your presentation today. A lot of good information in here, a lot of great information, and to be honest with you, a lot of good stuff that we're actually implementing here in Bexar County. Yes, thank you so much for being with us today. If no one has any questions, final thoughts, I think we're pretty good.
No, I think somebody asked if they would be, and I can too. They wanted to know how they could get access to the slides, and I haven't sent them to you yet. I'd be happy. No, should I send them to you? And is there a place they get posted?
Yeah, that'll be great. Actually, folks, so we're actually recording all of our sessions, and they will be posted at a later time. So just keep on. If you want to look. Follow us on all of our social medias. We'll make announcements on that as well, of where you can find links to our sessions.
Okay, and then I just have one last plug now. I love coming to Texas. I live in Minnesota, but I have family in Texas. Shelli knows this. I love Texas. So if you want technical assistance or training, all of our services, my services are free. I would be happy to come to your community. I haven't been to San Antonio, so just waiting for an invitation, but I would love to come and see all of you and help you in all of your efforts as well. So thank you for sharing your time with me today.
Well, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. And be careful what you wish for, because we will call upon you.
Well, Shelli knows. I'll come visit Shelli too.
Yes, and I love to be in San Antonio. I'm a UTSA graduate, so I 4 years of my life were there, and I love to be back, even virtually. So thank y'all for the invitation.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us today.
Shelli, it's always a dream to be with you. Thank you so much, and everybody enjoy the rest of your day. Take good care.
Bye-bye, y'all.
Bye. Take care. Bye-bye.